Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Easy English Spark. I'm so excited to have you here today. Get ready for an incredible journey that will enhance your English listening and speaking skills while immersing you in a powerful and inspiring story. Through this adventure, you'll experience life's ups and downs, friendship, love, challenges, and success, while naturally improving your fluency and confidence. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Let's get started and light up your English journey. Chapter 1: The Birth of a New Journey. When I was born, my mother named me River. She often told me that she had always dreamed of having a child whose name would remind her of the calm, flowing streams she loved to walk by in the peaceful hills near our home. To her, a river symbolized strength, tranquility, and a journey that never ends. I guess that's why she chose my name. But my life didn't exactly start out as peaceful as she had hoped. My father was a sailor. He spent much of his life at sea, working on large cargo ships that traveled to faraway places. I never knew him very well. He was gone for months at a time, only returning home every now and then to see me and my mother. But the one thing I always remember about him is his deep, steady voice and the way he would talk about the ocean with such love. He spoke of it as if it were both a friend and a constant companion. I admired him for his courage, his sense of adventure, and his deep respect for the world beyond our small town. But my father's life ended far too soon. I was just a few months old when tragedy struck. One day, while he was working on the deck of his ship, a massive crate of bananas fell off the side of the ship and struck him. It happened so fast, no one saw it coming. 1 minute, he was there, working, and the next, he was gone. The doctors said it was the impact of the crate that killed him almost instantly. It was one of those freak accidents that you never think could happen, but it does. The kind of thing that changes everything, even when you're not ready for it. That day, the world felt different. My mother was left to raise me on her own. She had her moments of sorrow, of course, but she never let me see how much it hurt. She carried on, taking care of me with a love that never wavered. Still, I could sense her sadness, and I felt the absence of my father every day. He had been a big presence in our lives, and now that presence was missing, leaving a quiet void in our home. Growing up without my father was something I came to accept, but it didn't make it easier. I always wondered what it would have been like if he had been there, watching me grow up, teaching me things about life, about the world. I remember asking my mother once what my father would have been like if he had been around longer. She smiled gently and told me that he would have been proud of me. But no matter how hard she tried, I still felt the weight of his absence. As I grew older, I started to develop my own sense of identity, though I was still a little confused about where I fit into the world. I wasn't like other kids. I was a little slow to catch on to things, a little behind in some areas, but I didn't mind. I was content just being me. I played with the other children in the neighborhood, and at first everything seemed fine. We'd run through the streets together, chasing one another, playing games that felt like they would last forever. But, as is often the case, that innocence didn't last. One day, a few boys from school decided I wasn't quite like them. They started to tease me, calling me names and making fun of the way I spoke. It wasn't anything too harsh at first, just the kind of teasing that kids sometimes do, but it hurt. I remember the sting of it, the feeling that I didn't belong, that I was different in a way that set me apart from everyone else. My mother noticed this change in me, and she wasn't having any of it. She always told me that I didn't need to worry about what other people thought, that the world would try to tell me who I was, but I should never listen to them. She wanted me to be strong, to stand tall, and not let anyone tell me I wasn't good enough. So, she made the decision that I should stop playing with those boys. "They're not your friends," she said. "You deserve better than that." It was hard for me to understand at the time, but I listened to her. She was my rock, and I trusted her completely. But even after we stopped playing together, I still felt the loneliness creeping in. I tried to make new friends, but it wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. Every time I tried to approach the girls, they would giggle and run away. I don't know if it was because they were scared or because they just didn't want to play with me, but it hurt. I was different, and no matter how much I tried, it felt like there was no place for me. I spent the next year in a regular school, hoping that things would get better. But the bullying continued. I would try to join in with the others, but they would laugh and run away, leaving me standing alone. It wasn't that they hated me, I don't think. It was just that I didn't quite fit in with their idea of what was normal. It wasn't until I was transferred to a special school that things started to change. This new school was different. It was filled with kids who had their own challenges, their own struggles. And for the first time, I didn't feel so alone. We were all trying to figure things out, trying to find our place in the world. I spent a lot of time there, and over the years, I grew. I grew in size, in strength, and in confidence. By the time I was 16, I was bigger than the other kids, and I started to feel like I might finally have found my place. But even then, life had a funny way of throwing new challenges at me. One day, a man pulled up in a car next to me and asked my name. I told him. He asked about the school I went to, and I told him that it was a special school. He seemed intrigued. Then, he asked me if I played football, and I told him that I didn't. I didn't play because no one had ever asked me to. I had never really been included in anything. That's when the man told me that he could help me change that, and that's when my life started to shift again. And so, the journey began. A new chapter in my life. One where, perhaps for the first time, I felt like there was a place for me in this world. A place where I could belong. Little did I know, that man in the car would be the one who changed everything for me. Chapter 2. The New School. After that day when the man in the car asked about my school, my life began to change in ways I couldn't have imagined. I didn't know it at the time, but meeting that stranger would set me on a path I never expected. It all started when he told me that he could get me into a new school, one where things would be different. A school where I could grow, be part of something, and most importantly, be treated like everyone else. At first, I wasn't sure what to think. My mother and I didn't have a lot of money, and the idea of changing schools seemed daunting. I had spent so many years at the old school, trying to find my way, trying to figure out where I fit. And then, out of nowhere, this man was offering me a fresh start. My mother, however, didn't hesitate. She saw this as an opportunity for me to have a better chance at life, a chance to escape the loneliness that had followed me for so long. She always wanted the best for me, and she believed in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself. So, we packed up what little we had and left behind the only world I had known. My mother's face was a mixture of hope and uncertainty as we drove to the new school. I had no idea what to expect, but I knew this was a chance to start again. When we arrived, I could tell right away that this school was different. The building wasn't anything special to look at from the outside, but when we walked through the doors, it felt like something new, something full of possibility. The walls were lined with colorful posters, and the air was buzzing with the chatter of kids, some of them laughing, some of them talking seriously. It felt alive. I wasn't used to this. The school I had come from felt empty in comparison. I was introduced to a man named Mr. Ellis, the headmaster of the school. He seemed kind, but he had a way of looking at me that made me feel like he was trying to figure me out. His eyes were sharp, and there was something in the way he spoke that made me think he had seen many different kinds of people come through his doors. He welcomed me with a warm handshake, but I could tell he was also sizing me up, trying to understand who I was. As Mr. Ellis showed us around, I realized that this school was special. It wasn't like the others where the focus was on grades or fitting into a particular mold. Here, it was about helping kids find their strengths, whatever they might be. I met a few of the other students as we toured the classrooms. Some were younger, some were older, and many of them were in situations much like mine. Some had trouble with reading, some had difficulty walking or speaking, but none of that seemed to matter. What mattered was that we were all there, trying to figure out how to be the best versions of ourselves. The school wasn't like the typical one where everyone was trying to act the same. It felt like a place where people were allowed to be different, where it was okay to not fit the usual mold. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was standing out in a bad way. I didn't feel like I was the odd one out. Instead, I felt like I belonged. My first few days were a blur of new faces and unfamiliar routines. I spent a lot of time in the classroom with Mr. Ellis and the other teachers. They were kind, patient, and willing to work with me at my own pace. The other kids were friendly too. There were a few who would still look at me strangely, but I didn't mind. I was getting used to this new world where I didn't feel so out of place. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. One of the first lessons we had was about learning how to work in groups, and that's when I realized that I still had a lot to learn. The other kids seemed to know what they were doing, while I was struggling to keep up. I would get distracted easily or not fully understand the instructions, but Mr. Ellis saw that I was trying, and he made sure to help me along. He didn't rush me. He gave me the time I needed. One day, as I was walking down the hallway after class, I ran into a girl named Clara. She was sitting on a bench by herself, looking down at the floor. I didn't know her very well, but I had noticed her before. She had a quiet way about her, and I figured she was probably one of those kids who liked to be left alone. I wasn't sure how to start a conversation, but I took a deep breath and sat down next to her. "Hi," I said, trying to sound casual. "What are you doing?" She looked up at me with a slight smile. "Just thinking," she said softly. "I don't have much to do right now." I nodded, unsure of what to say next. But Clara didn't seem bothered by my silence. She didn't seem to mind that I wasn't always great at talking. Slowly, we started to chat. We talked about the weather, about the teachers, and about the fact that both of us had trouble fitting in at our previous schools. Clara explained that she didn't like playing the same games as the other kids, but here it didn't seem to matter. From that moment on, Clara became my first real friend at the new school. She was kind, understanding, and she never made me feel like I was different. She also helped me get through the tough days, and I started to feel a sense of belonging I had never felt before. As time went on, I began to change. I wasn't the same kid I had been when I first arrived. I was starting to find my voice, starting to find my place. I wasn't perfect, far from it, but I was improving. The teachers at the school worked with me in ways that no one had ever done before, and I started to catch up in the areas where I had fallen behind. One day, after several weeks of working on my skills, I was invited to try out for the school's soccer team. I had never played sports before, not seriously anyway. But the coaches saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. They didn't care that I was different. They didn't care that I had no experience. They just wanted me to try. I remember the first time I stepped onto the field. I was nervous, unsure of myself. I fumbled with the ball at first, and the other kids laughed. But Coach Daniels, the soccer coach, didn't get angry. He just smiled and said, "You'll get it. Just keep going." And that's exactly what I did. Day by day, I got better, and before I knew it, I was part of the team, running, alongside kids who had been playing for years. This was it, the turning point in my life. The moment I realized that I could be more than just the kid who never quite fit in. I could be a part of something real. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was just walking along the side of the road, hoping to find a place. I was finally on the path, and I was ready to keep going. The new school wasn't just a place of learning. It was a place of discovery, of growth, and of hope. And for me, it was the beginning of a new journey. A journey I was ready to take with the support of my friends, my teachers, and the people who believed in me. Chapter 3: The Football Team. As the sweltering heat of August enveloped the University of Mississippi, a young man named Jack Thompson arrived on campus, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Standing at an imposing 6 feet, 6 inches, and weighing 240 pounds, Jack was not the typical freshman. His journey to this point had been anything but ordinary. Jack's early years were marked by challenges. With an IQ of 70, he often found himself at odds with the traditional educational system. However, his life took a dramatic turn in high school when his exceptional running speed caught the attention of Coach Harris. Recognizing Jack's potential, Coach Harris ensured he was integrated into the school's football program, where Jack's raw talent began to shine. Now, at the University of Mississippi, Jack was stepping into a new world. The campus buzzed with activity as students moved into dormitories, attended orientation sessions, and familiarized themselves with the sprawling grounds. Jack's dorm room, located in the heart of the campus, was a modest space he shared with a fellow freshman named Curtis. While many assumed that their shared experiences would foster a bond, the reality was different. Curtis, meticulous and particular, often clashed with Jack's more laid-back demeanor. Their differences became evident when a minor mishap involving Curtis's belongings escalated into a heated argument, leading Jack to seek solace elsewhere. Feeling out of place in the dormitory, Jack discovered a quiet corner in the basement of the athletic building. With a simple setup of an electric light bulb and a cot, this space became his refuge, a place where he could escape the complexities of social interactions and focus on what he loved most: football. Academically, Jack's schedule was tailored to accommodate his athletic commitments. Enrolled in courses like physical education, he was also required to take English and a science class. The latter, an intermediate light physics course, was notoriously challenging, even for graduate students. Yet Jack's unique way of processing information allowed him to grasp complex concepts with surprising ease. In English class, an assignment to write an autobiography led Jack to pen down his life story with raw honesty. His professor, captivated by Jack's narrative, mistook it for a work of fiction and praised its authenticity. On the football field, Jack's prowess was undeniable. The playbook, however, was a source of anxiety. The intricate diagrams and terminologies seemed like a foreign language. During practice sessions, while other players executed plays with precision, Jack relied on his instinct: catch the ball and run as fast as possible. This straightforward approach often led to unexpected successes, leaving both teammates and coaches in awe. The first game of the season was a spectacle. The stands overflowed with enthusiastic fans, the air thick with anticipation. As the game progressed, the team's strategy became muddled, and confusion reigned on the field. Seizing the moment, the quarterback handed the ball to Jack. Without a second thought, he sprinted down the field, evading defenders with a combination of agility and sheer determination. The crowd erupted in cheers as Jack crossed into the end zone, securing a pivotal touchdown. His performance didn't just contribute to the team's victory, it solidified his place as a key player. In the aftermath of the game, while celebrations erupted across campus, Jack sought solitude. Wandering through the quiet corridors of the dormitory, he stumbled upon a room where soft melodies floated through the air. Inside, he found a fellow student, Ben, nursing a broken foot. Ben introduced Jack to the harmonica, an instrument he played to pass the time. Intrigued, Jack picked it up and, with Ben's guidance, began to produce soulful tunes. Music became another avenue for Jack to express himself, offering a respite from the pressures of academics and athletics. Days turned into weeks, and Jack's routine settled into a rhythm. Early morning practices were followed by classes, and evenings were reserved for quiet harmonica sessions. One Sunday afternoon, as the golden hues of the setting sun bathed the campus, a familiar voice called out to him. Turning, Jack saw Emily, a friend from his hometown and a constant source of encouragement. Their reunion was filled with laughter and shared memories, a reminder of the support system that had always believed in him. As the semester progressed, Jack's journey was a testament to resilience and adaptability. Despite the challenges posed by his intellectual limitations, he navigated the complexities of university life with determination. Through football, he found a platform to showcase his abilities, and through music, he discovered a medium to connect with others. Jack's story was not just about overcoming obstacles, but about embracing one's unique path and finding strength in unexpected places. Chapter 4. A New Friendship. When I first arrived at the University of Mississippi, everything felt overwhelming. The massive buildings, the endless hallways, the sea of students rushing from one class to another. It was all so different from the small town where I had grown up. But there was one place where I felt safe, where I felt like I belonged: the football field. Football had given me purpose, a reason to be here, even though I still struggled with academics and social interactions. The rules of the game were simple. For me, get the ball and run as fast as I could. That was something I could understand, something I was good at. But outside of football, things were much harder. I didn't know how to make friends. I had always been different, and that difference had often set me apart from other people. I wasn't good at small talk. I didn't understand jokes the way others did, and I never knew exactly what to say in a conversation. At first, I thought maybe my teammates would become my friends. After all, we played together, trained together, and spent hours on the field side by side. But when practice was over, they all went off in their own groups, laughing and talking like they had known each other forever. I wanted to join in, but I didn't know how. One afternoon, after a long day of training, I was sitting alone at the campus dining hall. The place was filled with the noise of students talking and laughing, but I just focused on my plate, eating, quietly. That's when someone sat down across from me. "Hey, mind if I sit here?" a voice asked. I looked up. It was a guy I had seen before, one of the other football players, but he wasn't as big as me. He had curly black hair and a wide grin that made it seem like he was always up to something. "My name's Benny," he said, holding out his hand. I hesitated for a second before shaking it. "I'm Jack." "I know," Benny said with a chuckle. "Everybody knows you, man. You're fast as hell. Coach says you might be the best running back we've had in years." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. Benny didn't seem to mind the silence. He started talking about football, asking me about my favorite plays, what kind of training I liked best. Slowly, I started to relax. I might not be great at talking, but I knew football. It was something I could talk about. After that, Benny started sitting with me at lunch every day. He'd tell me stories about growing up in Texas, about his crazy little brother who once tried to wrestle an alligator, or about the time he accidentally set his backyard on fire during a 4th of July celebration. I never had stories like that to share, but I liked listening. One evening, after practice, Benny waved me over. "Come on, let's go for a walk." "Where?" I asked. "You'll see," he said with a grin. We walked across campus, past the student center and the library, until we reached a small music store tucked between two buildings. The windows were filled with guitars, violins, and old records. Benny pushed open the door, and the sound of blues music filled the air. "You ever play an instrument?" Benny asked, picking up a harmonica from a shelf. I shook my head. "Try this," he said, handing it to me. I hesitated before putting it to my lips. I blew into it, and a sharp, awkward sound came out. Benny laughed. "All right, not bad for your first try." He showed me how to hold it properly, how to move my fingers, and how to breathe the right way. I listened carefully, trying to copy him. After a while, the notes started to sound better. Not great, but better. "You've got a good ear," Benny said. "Keep practicing, and you might be pretty decent." That night, I sat on my bed in the dorm, playing the harmonica until I fell asleep. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had found something new, something that wasn't just football. Over the next few weeks, Benny and I became inseparable. He was always coming up with new things for us to do, going to music clubs, playing card games, sneaking out late at night to sit by the river and talk about life. He was the first person who didn't seem to care that I wasn't like everyone else. One day, after practice, we were sitting on the bleachers when Benny turned to me with a serious expression. "Jack, do you ever feel like people don't Really get you? I looked down at my hands. Yeah, me too, he said. I mean, maybe not in the same way, but I know what it's like to feel like you don't quite fit in. I didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever really put it into words before. Benny sighed and stretched his arms. But you know. What? Who cares? Screw what people think. You do your thing and I'll do mine. That's all that matters. I nodded. I wasn't sure I believed him yet, but I wanted to. As the football season went on, Benny became my biggest supporter. During games, he was always the first one to slap me on the back after a touchdown, the one yelling the loudest from the sidelines. He pushed me to be better, to work harder, but more than that, he showed me what it meant to have a real friend. Someone who didn't just see me as the fast guy on the football field, but as a person. Someone who didn't care if I struggled with words, who didn't laugh at me when I got confused, who just liked me for who I was. One night after we had won a big game, Benny and I sat on the steps of the dorm, watching the stars. You know, Jack, he said, I think you're gonna do something great one day. I frowned. I just run fast. Yeah, but it's not just that, he said. You've got something special. You just don't see it yet. I thought about that for a long time after Benny went to bed. I didn't feel special. I was just me. But for the first time, I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, that was enough. And so, with Benny by my side, my world started to feel a little bigger, a little brighter, a little less lonely. Chapter 5: The College Experience. The first few weeks of college were a whirlwind. Everything felt bigger, faster, and more intense than anything I had ever experienced before. The buildings stretched high into the sky, towering over me like giants. The classrooms were packed with students who all seemed to know exactly what they were doing, while I struggled to keep up. And then there was football. A whole new level of intensity that made high school games feel like nothing more than playground scrimmages. At first, I felt lost. I knew how to run. I knew how to play football. But college wasn't just about sports. There were rules to follow, schedules to keep, and classes that I didn't quite understand. The professors talked so fast, using words that I had never heard before, and I found myself staring at my notebooks, hoping the right answers would just appear. Benny was the one who helped me the most. He'd sit with me in the library after practice, helping me go through my assignments, breaking things down in a way that actually made sense. All right, Jack, he'd say, tapping his pencil against the desk. You don't need to be a genius. To pass these classes, you just gotta learn the tricks. The tricks? I asked. Yeah, he said with a grin. Like, for history, don't try to remember everything. Just remember the big events, and the little stuff will start making sense. And for English, just write like you're telling a story. You like telling stories, right? I nodded. Then, do that, he said. College isn't about being the smartest guy in the room. It's about surviving. I liked the way he put that. Surviving. That made sense to me. Still, there were moments when I thought about giving up. The weight of everything. Football, school, being in a place where I felt like I didn't fully belong. It got to me sometimes. But then there was football. When I was on the field, everything else disappeared. The moment the ball was in my hands, my legs moved before my brain could even process it. The crowd faded into the background, and the only thing that mattered was the end zone. Coach Simmons saw something in me, something I didn't even see in myself. "You're gonna be great, Jack," he told me after practice one day. "You just gotta trust yourself." I wanted to believe him. I really did. Meeting Emily. Again one afternoon, I was sitting in the campus cafe trying to figure out my homework when I heard a voice I hadn't heard in years. "Jack?" I turned, and there she was, Emily. The same Emily I had known back in my hometown, the girl who had always been kind to me when others weren't. She looked different now. Her hair was shorter, and she carried herself with more confidence, but that same warm smile was still there. "I thought that was you," she said, laughing as she sat down across from me. "I can't believe you're here." "Yeah," I said, still surprised. I go to school here now." "I can see that," she said. "And you're playing football?" I nodded. "Yeah, it's hard though. School is hard." She tilted her head, studying me for a moment. "You always did things your own way, Jack. That's what makes you special." I didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever called me special before. From that day on, Emily and I started spending more time together. She helped me with my classes, just like Benny did. And she made me feel like I wasn't just a football player, but a real student. "You belong here, Jack," she told me one night after we finished studying. "Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." I held on to those words. The first big game. The first big game of the season was against our biggest rival, and everyone was on edge. The stadium was packed with thousands of fans, the air buzzing with excitement. I could barely hear myself think over the roar of the crowd. Benny was hyped up, bouncing on his feet. "This is it, Jack," he said, slapping my back. "This is where you show 'em what you got." The first half of the game didn't go well. Our team was struggling, and the other side was ruthless. They were fast, strong, and they knew exactly how to shut us down. Then, in the third quarter, Coach Simmons called my name. "Jack, you're up!" I swallowed hard and jogged onto the field. The quarterback gave me a nod, and then the play began. The moment I got the ball, everything slowed down. The defenders rushed toward me, but I dodged one, then another. My legs carried me forward, faster and faster, until I was nothing but a blur. The crowd erupted as I crossed into the end zone. Touchdown. It was like a switch had been flipped. From that moment on, everything changed. My teammates started trusting me more, passing me the ball whenever they could. I scored 2 more times. Before the game ended, and when the final whistle blew, we had won. As we left the field, Benny threw an arm around my shoulders. "You did it, man. You're a star now." I didn't feel like a star. I just felt happy. The unexpected turn. Just when things were starting to look up, life threw another curveball. One night, I got a call from home. It was my mom. "Jack," she said, her voice shaking. "It's about your father." My stomach twisted. I barely remembered my father. He had left when I was little, disappearing without a word. My mother never talked about him much, and I had learned not to ask. "He's in the hospital," she said. "He's sick, Jack. Real sick." I didn't know what to say. For days, I wrestled with the news. Should I go see him? Did he even want to see me? Did I want to see him? Emily was the one who finally made me decide. "You don't have to forgive him," she said gently. "But if you don't go, you might regret it." So I went. When I walked into the hospital room, my father looked at me with tired eyes. He was weak, thinner than I had imagined him, but his face still had the same sharp features I remembered. "I heard you're playing football," he said, his voice rough. "Yeah," I said. There was a long silence. "I messed up," he admitted. "I wasn't there when I should have been." I didn't know how to respond. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "But I'm proud of you, son." I had waited my whole life to hear those words, and as much as I wanted to be angry, to hate him for leaving, I couldn't. Because in that moment, I realized something. Football, college, everything I had done so far, it wasn't just about proving something to others. It was about proving something to myself. And for the first time, I knew I was on the right path. Conclusion: college wasn't just about football or classes. It was about learning who I was, facing the past, and figuring out where I was going. I had friends now, people who believed in me. And most importantly, for the first time in my life, I was starting to believe in myself. The journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Chapter 6: The Army Life. After college, I didn't know what was next. Football had been my whole world, but I wasn't the best student, and my grades weren't enough to keep me there any longer. The school had done all they could for me, and it was time for me to move on. One day, I got a letter in the mail. It was from the U.S. Army. They wanted me. I didn't know much about the Army. I had seen it in movies, heard about it on the news, but I never thought I'd be part of it. The letter said I had to report for basic training, so I packed my things and got on a bus, heading toward the unknown. Basic training. The first thing I learned in the Army was that they didn't care who you were before you got there. The moment I stepped off the bus, a drill sergeant was screaming in my face. "Thompson, what kind of name is that? You think this is a vacation, son?" "No, sir," I said quickly. "Did I ask for your opinion?" "No, sir," I repeated. It didn't matter if you were fast, smart, or strong. The army broke you down so they could build you back up. Basic training was tough. The days started before sunrise. We ran for miles, did push-ups until our arms felt like they would fall off, and trained until we could barely stand. Everything had to be done perfectly. If one person in the unit messed up, we all paid for it. I wasn't used to being yelled at all the time, but I did what I was told. I ran when they said run. I marched when they said march. And when we had to crawl through the mud under barbed wire, I did it without a word. Surprisingly, I was good at following orders. I didn't overthink things. I just did what they told me to do. One day, the drill sergeant called me over. "Thompson, you're the fastest damn soldier I've ever seen. You ever think about joining the Army Rangers?" I shook my head. I didn't even know what that was. They need tough men. You up for it? I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. And just like that, my life took another turn. Deployment to Vietnam. After training, they sent us to Vietnam. I had never been outside the country before, and when I stepped off the plane, the heat hit me like a wall. The air was thick, the jungle stretched out endlessly, and the sound of insects and distant gunfire filled the air. I was assigned to a unit full of men just like me, young guys who had been thrown into something they didn't fully understand. Some were excited, thinking they'd become heroes. Others were scared but tried to hide it. Me? I just followed orders. Our leader was Sergeant Daniels, a tough, no-nonsense guy who had been in the Army for years. He didn't smile much, but he knew what he was doing. "We look out for each other," he told us. "You keep your head down, follow orders, and you'll make it home." I believed him. Our days were spent patrolling through thick jungle, searching for enemy forces. The heat was unbearable, the insects never left us alone, and the fear of an ambush was always there. One night, while we were setting up camp, I met a guy named Lewis. "Where are you from, Thompson?" he asked as we sat by the fire, eating rations. "Mississippi," I said. "No kidding? I'm from Alabama." We talked for hours about football, home-cooked meals, and the things we missed. Lewis became my closest friend in the unit. He was the kind of guy who could make a joke out of anything, even in the middle of a war. "I bet you were one of those guys who ran the ball in high school," he said one night. "I was," I told him. "Knew it," he said, shaking his head. "You look like a runner." That night, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a friend again. The first battle. We were in Vietnam for about a month before we saw real combat. It happened in the middle of a routine patrol. We were moving through a dense jungle when suddenly, bullets ripped through the trees. "Get down!" Sergeant Daniels yelled. I hit the ground, my heart pounding. The gunfire was deafening, and I had no idea where the enemy was. "Return fire!" We started shooting into the jungle, but it was chaos. I saw men go down, heard them screaming for medics, and the whole world felt like it was on fire. Then I heard Lewis yell. I turned and saw him lying in the mud, clutching his leg. He was hit. Without thinking, I ran to him. "Thompson, stay down!" Daniel shouted. But I didn't listen. I grabbed Lewis under the arms and started dragging him toward safety. Bullets flew past us, but I kept moving. I ran as fast as I could, pulling him along. Somehow we made it behind cover. "You're crazy," Lewis gasped, his face pale from the pain. "You'll be all right," I told him. The battle lasted for hours, but we held our ground. When it was over, we had lost a lot of men, but Lewis was still alive, and that was all that mattered to me. Becoming a hero. After that day, everything changed. Word spread through the camp about how I had pulled Lewis to safety, and suddenly, I wasn't just another soldier. Sergeant Daniels called me into his tent one morning. "You got guts, Thompson," he said. "We need more men like you." I didn't feel like a hero. I had just done what felt right, but the Army saw it differently. A few weeks later, I was called up in front of my unit. A general pinned a medal to my chest and shook my hand. "For bravery in the face of enemy fire," he said. The whole thing felt strange. I didn't do anything special. I just ran fast, like I always did. But for the first time, I realized that maybe that was enough. The end of the war. Months passed, and the war dragged on. We lost good men, and every day felt like it could be our last. One day we got the news. We were going home. The war was ending, and we had done our part. I should have been happy, but all I could think about was the friends we had lost. I looked around at the men in my unit and wondered what would happen next. What kind of life was waiting for us back home? When the plane took off, I looked out the window at the jungle below, knowing I would never see it again. Coming home. When I stepped off the plane in the U.S., everything felt different. The world had moved on while we were gone. People were laughing, going about their lives like nothing had happened. Benny was there waiting for me. "Jack," he called, waving. I walked toward him, my duffel bag over my shoulder. "You did it, man," he said. "You made it back." I nodded, but I didn't know what to say. Coming home wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. The war had changed me. I wasn't the same guy who had left for Vietnam, but I was alive, and for now, that was enough. Conclusion. The Army had taught me a lot: how to follow orders, how to survive, and most importantly, how to be there for the people who needed me. But now I had to figure out what came next. My journey wasn't over. It was just beginning again. Chapter 7. The Shrimp Business. When I came home from the Army, everything felt different. The streets of my hometown were the same. The old trees still lined the roads, and the people still waved as they passed by. But I wasn't the same. The war had changed me. I had spent months in the jungle, waking up every morning not knowing if it would be my last. Now, I was standing in front of my childhood home, unsure of what to do next. My mother was waiting for me on the porch, her hands clasped together, tears in her eyes. "You're home, Jack," she whispered, pulling me into a tight hug. "Yeah, Mama," I said. "I'm home." But what did that even mean? What was I supposed to do now? A promise to keep. While I was in Vietnam, I made a promise to my best friend, Louis. Before he got injured, we used to talk about what we would do if we ever made it back home. "You know what I want to do, Jack?" Louis had said one night, staring up at the stars. "I want to start a shrimp business. My granddaddy was a fisherman. My daddy was a fisherman, and I'm going to be a fisherman too. You should do it with me." At the time, I laughed. "I don't know the first thing about shrimping, Louis." "You know how to run, don't you?" He had grinned. "Then you can learn how to catch shrimp." We had shaken hands on it, promising that if we made it back home, we'd start the best damn shrimp business the South had ever seen. But Louis didn't make it home, and I wasn't about to break my promise. Getting started. Starting a shrimp business wasn't easy. I had no boat, no equipment, and no idea where to begin. But I had determination, and sometimes that was enough. I took what little money I had and went down to the docks. The fishermen there looked at me like I was crazy. "You want to do what?" one of them asked, spitting tobacco into the water. "I want to start a shrimp business," I said. "I just need a boat." They laughed. Shrimping wasn't something you just started. It was a way of life, something you learned from the time you were a kid. But then I met old man Henry. Henry was a retired fisherman, a grizzled old man with a face like leather and hands rough from years at sea. He had spent his whole life on the water, but now he was too old to go out every day. "You serious about shrimping?" he asked me. "Yes, sir," I said. He studied me for a long time before nodding. "All right, then. I got an old boat sitting out back. She ain't much, but she floats. If you can fix her up, she's yours." I couldn't believe it. A boat. A real boat. It took me weeks to fix her up. I worked day and night, patching holes, scrubbing the deck, and making sure she wouldn't sink the moment I took her out. Finally, she was ready. I named her the Louis, in honor of my best friend. Learning the trade. The first time I took the Louis out, I had no idea what I was doing. I dropped the nets into the water and waited. And waited. And waited. Nothing. By the end of the day, I had caught a grand total of 5 shrimp. 5. I sat on the deck, staring at my tiny catch, feeling like a fool. Maybe everyone had been right. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this. But then I remembered something my drill sergeant used to say back in the Army. You don't quit just 'cause something's hard. You figure it out. So that's what I did. I started watching the other shrimpers, paying attention to where they went and how they worked. I listened to their stories, asked questions, and learned everything I could. I found out that shrimping wasn't just about throwing a net in the water and hoping for the best. It was about knowing the tides, understanding the weather, and figuring out when and where the shrimp would be. Little by little, I got better. After a few months, I was pulling in real catches, buckets of shrimp instead of just a handful. Expanding the business. One day, as I was unloading my shrimp at the docks, an old friend showed up. Benny. Jack. You're a damn shrimper now? He laughed, shaking his head. Guess so, I grinned. Benny had been my best friend in college, the guy who had helped me survive school. Seeing him again felt like finding a piece of my past. You making any money doing this? He asked, looking at my shrimp. Not much, I admitted. But I'm getting better. Benny scratched his chin, thinking, You ever thought about selling direct? What do you mean? Instead of selling your shrimp to the markets, what if you sold them yourself? Cut out the middleman? It was a crazy idea. But then again, so was starting a shrimp business in the first place. So we did it. Benny helped me set up a little stand by the docks. We put up a sign, Fresh Shrimp, Best in Town. At first, business was slow. People weren't used to buying straight from a guy off a boat. But then, word started to spread. This shrimp's fresh, a customer said. Better than the stores, another agreed. And just like that, we had a business. Before long, I had to hire extra help. I brought on a couple of local boys who needed work. And soon, the Lewis was going out every day, bringing in bigger and bigger catches. Benny handled the sales, and I handled the shrimping. It was a perfect team. Success and reflection. One night, after we had closed up shop, Benny and I sat by the water, drinking a couple of beers. You ever think about how crazy this is? Benny said, shaking his head. A few years ago, we were just a couple of college kids. Now we're running a damn shrimp empire. I laughed. I wouldn't call it an empire. Not yet, he smirked. I looked out at the water, the moon reflecting off the waves. I had done it. I had kept my promise to Lewis. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Conclusion. The shrimp business wasn't just about making money. It was about building something from nothing. It was about keeping my word to a friend who never got the chance to come home. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was for sure. This was just the beginning. And no matter what happened next, I was ready. Chapter 8. The Reunion. Life had settled into a rhythm. The shrimp business was thriving, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had a purpose outside of football and the army. Every morning, I'd wake up before the sun, take the Lewis out into the open waters, and bring back loads of shrimp. By noon, Benny and I would be selling them fresh by the docks, and by the evening, I'd sit on the back porch, watching the waves roll in, listening to the distant hum of the town winding down for the night. It wasn't a fancy life, but it was mine. But even with all that, there was always something missing. Or rather, someone. I thought about her more often than I wanted to admit. Emily. She had been a part of my life for as long as I could remember. First as the girl who was always kind to me, then as my closest friend, and maybe, just maybe, something more. But life had a funny way of pulling people apart. I hadn't seen or heard from her since college, and even though I told myself I had moved on, there was always that little voice in the back of my head, wondering where she was. And then, one day, she was just there. A familiar face. It was a Friday afternoon, and I was at the docks, haggling with an old restaurant owner about the price of shrimp. Benny was off talking to some customers when I saw her. She was standing a few feet away, staring right at me. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then she smiled. That same warm, familiar smile that I hadn't seen in years. "Jack?" she said. I froze. "Emily?" I managed to say, my voice coming out rough, like I had swallowed a handful of sand. She laughed, stepping forward. "I thought that was you. My God, it's been so long." I wiped my hands on my apron, suddenly feeling self-conscious. I was covered in sweat and smelled like the sea, while she looked beautiful. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, and she had a confidence about her that hadn't been there before. "What are you doing here?" I asked, still in shock. "I live here now," she said. "Moved back a few months ago." "Back?" I blinked. "I thought you left for good." She shrugged. "I did, for a while. But life doesn't always go as planned." I wanted to ask her what that meant, but before I could, Benny came jogging over. "Jack, we got—" He stopped mid-sentence when he saw Emily. "Oh, well, well, well. Look who's back." Emily grinned. "Benny, you haven't changed a bit." Benny smirked. "And you still look way too classy to be hanging around shrimp boys like us." Emily laughed, and for a moment, it felt like old times. Catching up. That evening, after we had packed up for the day, Emily and I went for a walk along the beach. "So, tell me everything," she said. "How did you end up a shrimp fisherman?" Chuckled. "It's a long story." "I've got time," she said, nudging me. So I told her. I told her about the army, about Lewis, about the promise I had made. I told her about how I had stumbled my way into the shrimp business, about fixing up the Lewis, and about how Benny had turned us into something bigger than I had ever expected. When I finished, she just stared at me for a long time. "I'm proud of you, Jack," she finally said. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that I had been waiting to hear those words from her for a long time. "What about you?" I asked. "What brought you back?" She hesitated, looking out at the water. "Life got complicated," she said finally. "I moved to the city, thought I'd make something of myself, but it wasn't what I expected. I got married, and then, well, I got divorced. I hadn't been expecting that, I'm sorry, I said. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. It's okay. Some things aren't meant to last. I just figured it was time to come home. We walked in silence for a while, the sound of the waves filling the space between us. Then, she said something that caught me off guard. I missed you, Jack. I swallowed hard. I missed you too. Something more. Over the next few weeks, Emily and I started spending more time together. She'd come by the docks in the mornings, watching as I worked. Sometimes she'd help out, laughing as she struggled to sort through the shrimp. You make this look so easy, she said one day, holding up a slippery shrimp with a disgusted look on her face. I grinned. It's an art. One evening, she invited me over for dinner. It was just the two of us, sitting in her little house with the windows open, letting in the warm summer air. Halfway through the meal, she looked at me and said, "Do you ever think about what could have been?" I set down my fork. What do you mean? She took a deep breath. Back in college, before everything changed, I knew exactly what she meant. Yeah, I said quietly. I do. She reached across the table, placing her hand over mine. Maybe it's not too late. My heart pounded. I had spent years thinking about this moment, about what I would say if I ever saw her again. And now, here she was, looking at me the way I had always hoped she would. But there was still that little voice in the back of my head, whispering doubts. What if I mess this up? I asked. Emily smiled. Then we'll figure it out together. A new beginning. From that night on, things were different. Emily became a part of my life again. But this time, it wasn't just friendship. We took things slow, but every moment felt like something out of a dream. One evening, we sat on the dock, watching the sunset over the water. You know, she said, leaning her head against my shoulder, I think this is exactly where I'm meant to be. I wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. Me too, I said. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running toward something or away from something. I was exactly where I needed to be, and this time, I wasn't alone. Conclusion: life had taken us in different directions, but somehow we had found our way back to each other. The past didn't matter anymore. The future was ours to create. Chapter 9: The Fatherhood Realization. Life had a way of surprising me. For years, I had believed my purpose was football, then the army, then the shrimp business. And when Emily came back into my life, I thought maybe love was the next chapter. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. The day I found out I was a father. The news that changed everything. It was a warm summer afternoon when Emily and I were sitting at her place, talking about nothing in particular. We had fallen into an easy rhythm over the past few months. Late-night walks, quiet dinners, mornings spent at the dock. But that day, something felt different. Emily had been quiet, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. "Jack," she said finally, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Yeah?" She took a deep breath. "There's something I need to tell you." I waited. She hesitated, then finally said, "You have a son." The words didn't make sense at first. I blinked. "What?" She swallowed hard. "His name is Luke. He's 5 years old. 5. That meant I couldn't breathe. "He's mine?" Emily nodded, her eyes filled with something I couldn't place. Fear, maybe. Or regret. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. I had a son, a whole human being out there in the world, carrying my blood, my name, and I had never even known. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I found out I was pregnant not long after we lost touch. I didn't know how to reach you. And when I finally did, you were in the army, then off building your life. I thought maybe it was better this way." "Better?" My voice cracked. Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I was scared, Jack. Scared you wouldn't want this. Scared you weren't ready." I didn't know what to say, because maybe she was right. Maybe I wasn't ready, but that didn't change the fact that I had a son. Meeting Luke. It took a few days before I worked up the courage to meet him. Emily had told me all about him, how he liked to draw, how he was obsessed with airplanes, how he had my eyes. But hearing about him and seeing him were two different things. The day finally came, and I found myself standing outside Emily's house, my palms sweating. "He's in the backyard," Emily said softly. "Take your time." I nodded, then took a deep breath and stepped outside. And there he was, a small boy with messy brown hair, sitting in the grass with a toy plane in his hands. He was making whooshing sounds, completely lost in his own world. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, as if sensing me, he looked up. Our eyes met. He studied me for a second, then tilted his head. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi," I croaked, my throat suddenly dry. He stared at me for another second, then held up his plane. "You like airplanes?" I swallowed. Yeah, I do." He grinned. "This one's my favorite." And just like that, I was pulled into his world. Learning to be a dad. I didn't know the first thing about being a father. I had spent my whole life following orders, being told what to do, by coaches, by drill sergeants, by life itself. But there was no rule book for this, no one telling me what the right move was. So I did what I knew how to do. I showed up. I started spending more time with Luke. At first it was small things, watching him color, pushing him on the swing, sitting beside him while he talked about dinosaurs and superheroes. Then it became more. I took him to the docks, showed him the boats. He was fascinated, asking a million questions about how they worked, how shrimp were caught, what it was like being out on the water. One afternoon, I let him step onto the Lewis for the first time. His eyes went wide. "This is so cool," I chuckled. "You think so?" He nodded furiously. "Can we go on it?" I hesitated. "You want to go out on the water?" He nodded again, bouncing on his feet. So we did. I took him out, just a short trip, letting him sit beside me as I steered. He laughed every time the boat rocked over the waves, and for the first time, I saw a piece of myself in him. And maybe, just maybe, I started to believe I could do this. Doubts and fears, but not everything was perfect. One night I sat on my porch, staring out at the dark horizon, my thoughts heavy. Benny sat beside me, sipping a beer. "You're thinking too much." I sighed. "What if I mess this up?" Benny raised an eyebrow. "You mean parenting? Or life in general?" "Both," I admitted. Benny chuckled. "Jack, let me tell you something. You ain't gonna be perfect. No one is. But you know what? Makes a good dad? What?" He pointed at me. "Showing up. That's it. You're already doing more than a lot of guys ever do." I let that sink in. Maybe he was right. Maybe being a father wasn't about knowing all the answers. Maybe it was just about being there. A realization. One evening, as I was tucking Luke into bed, he looked up at me with those big brown eyes. "Are you gonna stay?" he asked. The question hit me like a freight train. "Stay?" I echoed. Luke bit his lip. "Mama said you used to be far away, but you're here now." He paused. "Are you gonna stay?" I felt something in my chest tighten. I thought about all the years I had spent running toward something, running away from something, never staying in one place too long. But now, here was this little boy, looking at me like I was the most important thing in his world, and suddenly I knew. I cupped his small hand in mine. "I'm not going anywhere, buddy." A slow smile spread across his face. "Promise?" I nodded. "Promise." And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just saying it. I meant it. Conclusion. Becoming a father wasn't something I had planned. It wasn't something I was ready for. But life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It just happens. And sometimes, the best thing you can do is step up and embrace it. I wasn't perfect. I didn't have all the answers. But I was there. And for my son, for Emily, for myself, that was enough. Chapter 10. The final chapter. Life had taken me through so many twists and turns. Football, the army, the shrimp business, and then, the biggest surprise of all, fatherhood. I had spent most of my life searching for where I belonged, chasing something I couldn't quite name. But now, standing on the docks, watching the sun rise over the water, I finally understood. I was home, building a future. The shrimp business had grown into something I never could have imagined. What started as a promise to a fallen friend had turned into a real operation. Benny and I had expanded. We bought a second boat, then a third. We hired more men, people who needed a fresh start, just like I once did. We called the business Lewis and Thompson Shrimp Co., a tribute to my best friend from the Army, the man who had dreamed of doing this before he ever got the chance. Emily had become a part of it too. She had always been good with numbers, so she took over handling the finances, making sure we weren't just hauling in shrimp, but actually making money. And then there was Luke. He was growing up fast. Every day he reminded me more and more of myself. Curious, stubborn, always asking questions. But he was also smarter than I ever was at his age. He could sit for hours with a book, reading about ships, the ocean, history. One day, as we were out on the Lewis, he looked up at me and asked, "Dad, do you think I'll run the business one day?" I smiled. "If you want to." He nodded. "I think I do." And for the first time, I realized that everything I had built might actually mean something beyond just me. A proposal. One evening, Emily and I were sitting on the porch, watching Luke chase fireflies in the yard. The air was warm, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. I had been thinking about something for a long time, turning it over in my head. Finally, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small box. Emily glanced at me, then at the box, her eyes widening. "Jack," she whispered. I took a deep breath. I've been through a lot in my life. I've seen things I wish I could forget, and I've lost people I'll never get back. But through it all, the one thing that always felt right was you. Tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't want to spend another day wondering what comes next," I said. "I just want to spend it with you." I opened the box. Inside was a simple ring. Nothing fancy, just something I knew she would like. Emily laughed through her tears, shaking her head. "You big idiot," she said. "Is that a yes?" I asked, my heart pounding. She didn't answer. She just kissed me, and in that moment, I knew. This was it. This was my life, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. A wedding by the water. We got married a few months later in a small ceremony by the docks. It wasn't extravagant, just close friends, family, and the people who had been part of our journey. Luke stood by my side, beaming with pride. Benny was my best man, of course. As Emily walked down the makeshift aisle, the wind carrying her veil behind her, I thought about everything it had taken to get here. The boy who had once been laughed at for being different. The soldier who had run into battle without a second thought. The fisherman who had built a life out of nothing. It all led to this. And as I took Emily's hands in mine, I knew that I had finally found what I had been searching for all along. Looking ahead. Years passed. Luke grew up, went to college, and then, just like he had said all those years ago, came back to take over the business. Watching him steer the Lewis for the first time by himself was one of the proudest moments of my life. Benny eventually left to pursue a new dream, opening his own restaurant, using our shrimp as his main ingredient. He still visited every Sunday, telling stories that got bigger and wilder every time. Emily and I grew old together, watching the world change, watching our little town grow. And through it all, I never forgot where I came from. A letter to my son. One day, when I was much older, I sat down with a pen and paper and wrote a letter to Luke. By then, he was a grown man, running the business, raising his own family. I knew my time was getting short, and there were things I wanted him to know. So I wrote, "Dear Luke, if you're reading this, it means you've taken the helm. You're leading the business, and more importantly, you're leading your own life. And I couldn't be prouder. Life is funny, son. It takes you places you never expect. When I was your age, I thought my future was on a football field. Then I thought it was in the army. Then I thought it was out at sea. But in the end, my future was never about a place. It was about people. It was about your mother, who taught me what love really means. It was about Benny, who reminded me that laughter makes everything better. It was about Lewis, who showed me that dreams don't die, even when people do. And it was about you. You were the greatest thing that ever happened to me, Luke. So whatever you do, wherever life takes you, just remember this, don't chase a purpose. Find the people who make your life worth living, and once you find them, hold on tight. Because in the end, that's all that really matters." Love. Dad. The final sunset. I spent my last years sitting on that same porch, watching the water, feeling the breeze. And one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I closed my eyes and smiled, because I had lived a life worth living, and I wouldn't change a thing. The end. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.